Welcome to This Explainer. For over a century, history books have often treated the summer of 1914 as a foregone conclusion, right? Like it was just this mechanical, inevitable slide into the abyss. But the truth is actually far more terrifying. This was a living world. We're talking about a moment where individual human agency, some profound psychological flaws, and incredibly rigid systemic traps all violently collided. Today, we're going to completely deconstruct the myth that World War I was inevitable. We're going to immerse ourselves in the sheer uncertainty of that exact moment when outcomes were entirely unknown, risks were catastrophic, and frankly, flawed leaders plunged the globe into a war unlike anything seen before. So how on earth does a localized assassination, the shooting of one man, Archduke Franz Ferdinand on June 28, 1914, spiral into a worldwide conflagration that literally claims 16 million lives? To figure that out, we really have to stop viewing the July crisis as just a dull list of dates. Instead, think of it as a desperate, sweat-soaked countdown. It was a ticking clock in the stifling heat of that summer, where the point of no return was rapidly slipping away from terrified leaders who absolutely thought they were in control right up until the exact moment they realized they were entirely powerless. Let's dive right into part one, the spark and the trap. To understand why the world broke, we have to pull back from those bloody streets in Sarajevo and look at the competing webs of power dominating Europe at the time. On one side, you've got the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, basically a defensive pact. On the other side, you have the Franco-Russian alliance of 1894. But here is the crucial difference. The Franco-Russian Pact, which was born out of this mutual fear of being encircled by Germany, contained these terrifyingly automatic military mobilization triggers. Under Article 2 of their military convention, if any forces of the Triple Alliance mobilized, France and Russia were obligated to instantly mobilize their entire armies. And back then, mass conscription meant mobilization was virtually indistinguishable from an actual declaration of war. So this rigid system was essentially a massive geopolitical booby trap, fully primed and just waiting for a spark.
Which brings us to part two, the fatal blank check.
If we step inside the suffocating, psychologically claustrophobic decision rooms of Vienna and Berlin, we see that it was fear, pure fear, that drove these men to war. Austro-Hungarian leaders had been dealing with mounting anxiety long before the assassination, absolutely terrified that rising Slavic nationalism was going to dismantle their empire from the inside out. So in July 1914, they wanted a reckoning with Serbia, but they needed to know Germany had their back. Enter Kaiser Wilhelm II. Fearing he'd look weak again, kind of like in the 1912 Balkan crisis where Germany left Vienna hanging, Wilhelm issued the infamous blank check on July 5th and 6th. This was a promise of unconditional German support no matter where Austrian actions led. It was a fatal miscalculation. It completely empowered the hawks in Vienna to draft an impossible ultimatum because they mistakenly believed they could keep this a localized little war. And about that ultimatum, delivered on July 23rd at 6 p.m., it was absolutely not drafted to be accepted. It was cynically, meticulously engineered to guarantee that Serbia would reject it. Take the demand allowing an Austro-Hungarian-led internal judicial inquiry directly on Serbian soil. That is a deliberate, literally impossible infringement on national sovereignty. The war party in Vienna, including guys like Foreign Minister Berchtold, desperately wanted a pretext for a preventive invasion. They were using the assassination as their golden ticket to permanently crush the Serbian threat. Now for part three, desperate pleas between Willy and Nicky. As that Austro-Hungarian war machine starts gearing up, the crisis gets incredibly intimate. Bypassing their own foreign ministries, you have two royal cousins, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, engaging in this frantic late-night exchange of telegrams. They're being hammered out by exhausted operators as time is just slipping away. On July 29th, Tsar Nicholas sends this incredibly heartbreaking plea. He says, "I foresee that very soon I shall be overwhelmed by the pressure forced upon me." It just brings these historical figures to life, doesn't it? He's a fully realized human being, desperately trying to halt the momentum of his own hawkish military staff. Russia felt this profound obligation to protect Serbia, a fellow Slavic nation, but Nicholas clearly knew that triggering a mobilization, even a partial one, would spark a chain reaction he wouldn't be able to stop. Wilhelm's response in the early hours of July 30th is pretty haunting. He basically attempts to shift the entire geopolitical burden onto Nicholas, essentially saying, hey, if you mobilize, the blood is entirely on your hands. And astonishingly, even as they're threatening each other with continental annihilation, they're signing these telegrams with their childhood nicknames, Willy and Nicky. It's such a chilling paradox when you contrast it against the cold sweat of impending doom. Both men were suddenly waking up to the fact that their lifelong familial bonds, their personal diplomacy, were totally crumbling against the rigid, unstoppable realities of military schedules.
And, well, that is exactly what happened. Diplomacy completely failed. Despite all those frantic telegrams, Russian general mobilization was ordered. You see, in the minds of early 20th century generals, mobilization was a highly synchronized mechanical process. Once the train started rolling, you couldn't just hit the brakes without throwing your entire national defense into total chaos. The monarchs completely lost political control to their generals.
Moving to part 4, the inflexible military machine. At this point, human agency just evaporates. It gets replaced by the terrifying rigidity of railway timetables, troop quotas, and literally millions of men marching blindly toward the slaughter. Germany's military response was dictated entirely by a strategy they drafted nearly a decade prior, the Schlieffen Plan. Authored in 1905, this plan was Germany's desperate answer to their ultimate nightmare, a two-front war against both France and Russia. Since Russia's vast, underdeveloped railways would take an estimated 6 weeks to fully mobilize, Germany's plan was to hold the Eastern Front with just a skeleton force. The vast majority of the German army would execute a massive, lightning-fast flanking maneuver through Belgium, crush France in 6 weeks, and then board trains east to meet the Russian steamroller. But this inflexible mechanical algorithm had one absolutely fatal diplomatic flaw. The Schlieffen Plan required invading neutral Belgium, and Belgian neutrality had been guaranteed since the 1839 Treaty of London, an international pact signed by Britain and, crucially, by Prussia itself. So when Germany issued an ultimatum demanding free passage and then actually invaded, they were blatantly violating international law. This sheer military necessity forced a massive political disaster, handing the British government the exact justification it needed to abandon neutrality and jump into the conflict. The speed of this descent is just breathtaking. Over a single apocalyptic week, the trap completely snaps shut. July 28th, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. August 1st, responding to Russian mobilization, Germany declares war on Russia. August 3rd, tied to that rigid Schlieffen Plan, Germany declares war on France. And then August 4th, following the invasion of Belgium, the British Empire declares war on Germany. In just 7 days, a regional quarrel cascaded into a total global catastrophe. And finally, part 5, who broke the world? This brings us to the ultimate question that has haunted scholars for literally a century. Who actually bears the responsibility here? If we look at the modern historiographical debate, the academic landscape is fundamentally split in two. On one side, you have the conventional view, championed by historians like Fritz Fischer back in the 1960s, who argue that Imperial Germany meticulously planned and provoked a European war to achieve continental supremacy, a German mastermind, essentially. But on the other side, we have the revisionist view. They argue that 1914 was absolutely not some calculated master plan, but rather a systemic meltdown, driven by chaotic, reckless brinksmanship across all the major powers. Now, the conventional perspective actually originates with the very treaty that ended the war. Look at Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles, the infamous war guilt clause. This shows how the victorious powers pinned the blame firmly and exclusively on the imperialistic ambitions of Kaiser Wilhelm II and his military clique. It asserted that German aggression was the sole engine of the conflict. But actually, scratch that one-sided view for a second, because we really have to contrast this with modern revisionist historians. Scholars like T.G. Ott and Sean McMeekin point to a vastly different reality. Ott specifically highlights the poor intellectual quality of decision-making, suggesting Berlin wasn't the only one at fault. It was a catastrophic failure of diplomacy in Vienna, who drafted that impossible ultimatum, in St. Petersburg, who recklessly ordered mobilization, and even in London, where a lack of clear communication obscured British intentions until it was simply too late. It was a collective, massive failure of highly flawed individuals trapped inside a rigidly unforgiving system. So what does this all mean for us today? I want to conclude this explainer by turning this history back on ourselves. The men of 1914 were highly educated leaders who genuinely believed they could control the machinery of war through threats, ultimatums, and mobilization schedules. And they were dead wrong. So when we look at our modern world with our interlocking alliances, tripwire military commitments, and hypersonic escalations, are our geopolitical systems truly any more controllable than those of 1914? It's a pretty terrifying thought, realizing that the illusion of political control can still vanish in an instant. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this deep dive leaves you questioning not just the past, but the precariousness of our present.